Yeah. Welcome to Windows on the World. Yesterday we were in Bristol at the Arc Centre for our talk, The Bigger Picture, which featured myself, Sandy Adams and Piers Corbyn. Mr. Corbyn has gone back to London to talk about the electric universe. But Sandy Adams is with me and we're live from Glastonbury. I just thought I'd start out with a quote which I put in at the end of my talk yesterday. And it's from William James, American philosopher and psychologist, who died in 1910. And he stated, wherever a debate between mystics and scientists has been for all decided, it is the mystics who usually have proved to be right about the facts, while the scientists were better with the theories. And never has that been more true than today, because we're going to talk about scientific theories and also the Technocratic Society and the Technocracy Movement, which is behind an awful lot of the things that we talk about and was actually referred to yesterday in the talks. So we're going to talk a bit about the updated Technocracy Movement, but also where it came from. And I'm with Sandy, and as I say, we are live from Glastonbury. Welcome to everyone in chat. And we did a really good interview on the Richie Allen show the other day on Friday, and we got across a lot of points, so please have a listen to that, because we managed to get through some really interesting stuff, and we're going to expand on that as we always do. Our shows are a series of information episodes basically, and the archive is full of information, and often I go back into the archive and I find things which I've actually not forgotten about, but failed to recall because there's so much information in there. But when we look at what we call a post-truth world, the new post-truth and undemocratic society, which seems to be run on accepted dogma, it's also being steered by a scientific movement which is behind the Global Action Plan, which is implemented at a local level. This is how we define the Agenda 21, which is now Agenda 2030 principles, which are being imposed on everybody all around the world in their local communities. The so-called Sustainable Development Goals and this fake environmentalism. It's a total control grid, really, and it has its roots in the Technocracy movement of the 1930s. So the system of overt control relies on simplistic and dogmatic beliefs, instilled so useful and controllable workers can be monitored to carry out tasks efficiently and with as little wasted energy as possible, and having their every move thought monitored in real time in smart cities by the Internet of Things. We're going to get onto that a bit later as well. Now, this requires compliant servants ready to sacrifice their time and energy, and a lot of this is about voluntary sector. The voluntary sector is a huge part of this new fake community that we are seeing everywhere. There's nothing wrong with volunteering your services, but we have to actually analyse what we're volunteering our services for. But as we are being told it's for the collective or common good, there's obviously nothing to worry about. But this could be translated as a new form of feudalism dressed up in green and worthy credentials, using meaningless terms which cover their real meanings, such as sustainability, diversity, living in vibrant communities, walkable cities. Well, those two things mean being trapped in small spaces under complete control, taxed and worked to death, paying for cramped living spaces, which people will never own and will not be passed on to anyone, therefore keeping the population in debt enslavement and powerlessness. Now that seems a little bit bleak, but that's the worst possible scenario of what's going on. Sandy's sort of giggling in the background here, and is going to come in a minute. But the approach to technological advancement and the management of resources is something which is at the root of our talks on the bigger picture, the one we did yesterday, and we're going to be carrying on doing these talks, so do look at them on the website. This management of resources is the energy-based economy, the control of infrastructure, energy, and most importantly, people and their efficiency. So this economic and resilient control system is to work. In order for it to work, there must also be a control of minds, and that mind is to be a collective hive mind. This is being instilled as the third way. We talked about this yesterday, and it talks about through the Hegelian dialectic of thesis, antithesis into synergy, which basically could mean the right and left paradigm being basically turned into an area in the middle, which is political correctness, so nobody can be criticised about anything unless it's part of the narrow opinion corridor, which we're allowed to talk inside or debate inside. And of course we're outside that. So that's an interesting concept, because we're finding that a lot of people are outside it. So we do have a purpose. So in that sort of scenario, I suppose we'd be quite useful within a technocratic society. What do you think about that?
Absolutely.
Sandy, yeah, carry on.
We had a really good day yesterday, talking about what we always talk about, which is the bigger picture. When I was doing my research, I sort of was looking at the technocracy movement of the 1930s and seeing a parallel with what's happening now. And in fact, it is interesting that at that point in time, they did not have the technology. And it's almost as though it was waiting for now in order for it to be implemented. And it seems to have had a revival. And the person who revived it was Zbigniew Brzezinski in 1973. And he he studied... I'll take you right back to 1930 odd. The technocracy movement really was... It started in the 1930s. And it was headed up by somebody called M. King Hubbard. Not Hubbard. Hubbard.
Not to be confused with L. Ron Hubbard, of course.
Yes, the Scientologist. This guy was a political scientist, and he was at the time studying at Columbia University in America, and he teamed up with an engineer called Howard Scott, and they because in the 1930s, obviously there'd been this huge depression. And everybody had lost faith in politicians and the banking system and money and the way that it was all run at that time. And these guys got together with a whole bunch of their political scientist friends and economic friends and people who were studying economics at the time at Columbia. And they decided that what we needed to do was change the whole economy, the way the economy worked, into an energy-based economy instead of a price-based economy. So trading sort of, for money could go, and they could actually get rid of money and turn it into an energy-based economy. And that was the whole theory behind it. Which is interesting because that we're seeing that now in the whole environmental movement, the carbon taxing and all that kind of thing. They wanted to kind of replace capitalism because they were disillusioned with it at the time. And it's interesting because Zbigniew Brzezinski, he actually studied with M.K. Hubbard at Columbia University, and he brought this forward. He wrote a book called Between Ages, which was America's role in a technocratic age. And it was how this could actually become a reality for the technocratic age that we're living in now. And sure enough, he's a member of the Council for Foreign Relations or the Club of Rome, and was highly influential in the United Nations. So somehow this has been brought forward to now. And that whole ideology is being used by this whole fake environmentalism that we're
going to carry on with that tonight because I've got some good examples of that from a website and other websites, but we're going to look at some stuff that's on Technocracy website, the Patrick Wood website. Technocracy now.
Yeah, if you want to read a really good book, it's Technocracy Rising by Patrick Wood. He's a great one, and he talks about this whole movement that M.K. Hubbard and Scott actually got into in the 1930s, and how they set up a company called Technocracy Inc. And
I've got the website here, actually, Sandy. I can read some stuff off it now.
The website's still up and running, funnily enough, although they've passed. And it was interesting also at the time that they were at Columbia University. They shared a building with at Columbia University with IBM. The beginnings of the IBM technology, and they actually shared a basement building, so information would have been shared between IBM and MK Hubbard, and the whole sort of theory of the technocratic age. And it's interesting that obviously IBM then went back to Germany and set up big business in Germany, and we've got the whole technocracy movement happening there as well at that time. So very interesting stuff.
Oh, definitely. I'm just going to go to the horse's mouth here and read what it says on their website about the formation of the technocracy movement. It says here, Technocracy is an organisation that was started in 1918 by a group of doctors, scientists, educators and other professional, well-educated people in response to the indications that the new technologies and industrialisation changes would strongly affect both society and the environment. So you can see where that came in. They created a plan that would help to offset the damaging effects of those changes. This plan called for confirmed scientific knowledge. Oh, that was interesting, isn't it? Because now we seem to have gone against that. Could they say this plan called for confirmed scientific knowledge to be the first criteria in making decisions in planning for the future? Now, we're going to take that a bit of a step further and take that apart, actually, a bit later in the show, because there's been a new report concerning the climate change and the so-called science which is being used to enforce global taxation. So that's quite interesting. But they carry on with, it was not popular vote, not profit and not emotionalism, but strong, reasoned and scientific data which would convey which decisions in many areas would have a better outcome for society and the environment. Now that's kind of been turned on its head, hasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that, Brzezinski kind of revived this, and he actually called it the New Economic Order, which is what Tony Blair called it as well.
Yeah.
So we've got this whole thing coming forward, a good 30, 40 years to now, and it's almost as though it was created for now, and this whole fake environmentalism has taken it over for their own benefit. I mean, I do think those those people in the 1930s who were disillusioned with the economic system at the time probably had the best intentions, but it's been taken up on a big scale now by the people who deem themselves to be in control of the world, and so we're living with this technocratic age, and it's moving very, very fast.
Well, it certainly is, and we're going to be looking tonight into things like the 5G, the 5G testing at Canary Wharf, actually. Yeah. 5G is now being tested at Canary Wharf. The infrastructure there seems to be run by Arqiva, as it is in many of the other boroughs where the 5G is being implemented.
I read in Waltham Forest as well.
That's right.
On all the lampposts and what they call the street furniture.
Yeah, that's right. They put 16,500 in to start with. This is in a borough of 250,000. And yes, the Arqiva rollout was announced last year, I think, because the bidding went on in early 2017. But they tested the 5G in Canary Wharf because it's on private land. Therefore, they did not have to have council approval for the testing. That's quite interesting, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. No, it's a bit like the Square Mile in the city. Canary Wharf is privately owned. Not many people realise that. They have their own police force, their own security systems. They're not accountable.
Well, that's absolutely right, because they also held the Brownfield Summit there, which sold off all the council housing, so nobody could protest, because it is on private land, so that's quite interesting. But yeah, the 5G rollout is quite topical at the moment, and It's going on everywhere. By 2020, it's going to be installed. And of course, it's really based on a weapons system called the active denial system. You can look that up. They're millimeter pulsed waves. So it's a totally different technology. And what it's been sold as is an upgrade to 4G when it's actually nothing of the sort, isn't it?
No, it's not. It's nothing. It's a million miles from 4G. It's a pulsed technology that requires, because it's pulsed, it requires a lot more sensors. Like, if you don't want to be affected by EMF frequency at the moment, you can move. You don't have to live near a mast. You can move away from masts, but because most of them are out on motorways or they're on hills in the woods or wherever. But with 5G, you will not be able to escape it. It's on every lamppost. It needs to have a lot of sensors, and these sensors are very the frequency that they're running at is very sensitive to human skin. So you're absorbing this frequency very, very easily through your skin, and there's just and all the time that's happening, your devices are being data harvested as well and sold on to third parties. So we've got a real problem here. It is a very dangerous technology that has a lot of side effects, which we'll go into later. But you just can't escape it. If you're in a city, you will not be able to escape it. It's there, and it's bombarding you the whole time.
Yeah, we have covered that on the show, and people can find that in the archive. And there's plenty of other stuff about 5G, but the main thing is that it's been done without consent and it hasn't been tested. I think these are the main points about it. I'm just looking at this article here. And it says there, the Canary Wharf Group Head of Technology and Innovation, Mark Nallen, said, staying at the forefront of connectivity and new technologies is critical to our community, and that's why we are partnering with EE Parent Group, BT Group, to support delivery of 5G. The consumers who live and work here will benefit from being better connected. Now, how much better connected do they need to be? Because,
where will it end?
Well, exactly, because they're talking about more Wi-Fi hubs in towns, but why do they need more Wi-Fi hubs? They don't really, do they?
Well,
this is just a cover story for it.
I think the level of information sharing at the moment and connectivity is almost, I find it overwhelming now. But with the Internet of Things, it's going to take over everybody's lives. It'll get more complicated. We all know that since we've had Wi-Fi and Facebook and phones, smartphones, our lives have become more complicated. And they keep saying, it's going to make everything easier. I don't think it is.
Well, this is it. And in actual fact, I feel like getting further away from technology now.
Exactly. Yeah,
Maybe we should be the anti-technocracy movement.
Yes, I think we should. Yeah, that should happen now. We should form the anti-technocracy movement.
It's already been mentioned that the word Luddite has already been mentioned in tonight's show. So maybe people out there have got the right idea, uniquely in particular, I think. And Eric von Essex, it says there's some quite funny comments in there. Actually, Martin's just put, I bought a book about battleships in a charity shop the other day. But it's kind of relevant, but actually there's more coming. Which reminded me, because in our talk yesterday, Piers Corbyn has announced that there is a Ladybird book being written to counter the climate change religion. And I wanted to actually bring in something here. It's just reminded me that somebody sent an email who was at the talk yesterday, and it was from Nick Sheehan. And he said, regarding the climate change hoax, I feel it would have been useful to analyse and explain why the major environmental groups Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth are so taken in by this scam to the extent that they have made it their number one campaigning issue. I know many people, including me in the past, who will refer to these groups for an honest and trustworthy account of what's going on. These groups have huge public respect and access to a lot of media coverage, so explaining how they have been effectively hijacked would be very interesting. Yes, indeed. And we met one of the co-founders of Greenpeace, Patrick Moore, several years ago, who wrote the book Confessions of a Greenpeace Dropout, how this environmental movement was hijacked, completely hijacked. Now, this is what is a bigger picture. The bigger picture of the talks is all about this. It's about this controlling of the narrative by organisations and NGOs and change agents. And it's actually quite simple. If you want to control the narrative, you have to control all sides. It's called the system of parties and the system of moods. You need different moods, different parties, but basically they all have to become part of the same mechanism if things are going to work. And that's really what's behind what's going on. So this kind of the technocracy movement has been hijacked into a new form of feudalism, really, hasn't
Absolutely,
it?
Yeah. And
totally.
it's interesting that that China is living in a highly technocratic system at the moment, and it's almost as though, and Patrick does mention this in Technocracy Rising, that in order for technocracy to work efficiently, it almost needs a totalitarian environment where everything is controlled. And I really do think that's what we're heading for, because that's, every element of your life will be controlled and managed. If we go ahead with, if the smart cities are implemented and the 5G goes ahead and the Internet of Things, because the 5G is really supporting the Internet of Things, and the Internet of Things will only work if the smart cities need the Internet of Things. So it's all about how far does it go? How much are we being surveilled? How much are we? Because it really does look like a dystopian, totalitarian future for humanity if we are going to be herded into smart cities.
But I think the reaction will be, with a lot of people, against that, because what I see happening is that I know plenty of people who are going to marginalise the use of technology.
Yeah, I certainly will. Yeah.
Yes, and exactly, and just use older appliances.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't use smart TVs or anything like that, and I don't actually engage with a lot of this stuff. I mean, the whole of the social media thing, I think, in my view, is dying off a bit anyway, because it's, especially with Facebook, they kind of shot themselves in the foot, which is interesting because Tim Berners-Lee was talking about reinventing the internet to make your data more controllable.
Yeah.
So that, in my view, would be a good thing. However, it's all about personal choice, this stuff, up to a point, isn't it? I mean, we get a lot of it imposed on us, but we still do have choices. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think we do, and I think people are having a reaction, because I feel that ever since I've been banging on about Agenda 21, 2030, which is, Agenda 21 probably for the last 6 years, people have thought I was a conspiracy theorist. Now that they're being hit with smart technology, they're going, oh, hang on a minute, and they're realising that it is linked up, or joining the dots, because this is actually it all goes right back to to Agenda 21, to sustainable development, because the internet, the smartphone companies are actually saying we are going to further the goals of the development that that we're the whole environmental thing that we're engaged in at the moment. So I feel that sustainable development is being used the technology is being used to further sustainable development, and they've actually sounded that out and admitted it. So people are now beginning to think, oh well, actually, that sustainable development, if it's all to do with smart, we don't like it, we don't want it. So they're associating it with smart now, which before they couldn't join the dots. And I'm getting so many people now who are saying, right, I don't want a smart meter, and I understand what sustainable development is all about now. And that really is good, because if you don't want a smart meter, don't have a smartphone, don't engage with 5G.
Well, that's it. And once these terms have been decoded as to their real meaning, in other words, we talked about this yesterday, basically it all comes down to vibrant communities, which are monocultures, diversity, which means the same, and empowerment, which means complete disempowerment. But I just wanted to bring this in now, because cycling is a huge part of this agenda, isn't it? There's a phrase that they use in Waltham Forest, and it's to promote cycling. But in actual fact, it's to stop people using cars. Useful idiot Clyde Lokes, who got a mention in the talk yesterday as well, actually. He's the cabinet member for Environment in Waltham Forest. And he was out in his high-vis jacket, basically going up to people who were dropping their kids off at school and saying that he was going to fine them for idling their engines. Now, the problem is, with that, is that you can't stop outside schools because they've got zigzag lines. So what are you supposed to do? It's kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't, making it impossible. And you can't get through to these people. And I actually asked him for a debate when he called the 40 chapters of Agenda 21 a conspiracy theory, and there was no response. You can find all that actually on a video called London's Dystopia Public Winning Fight Back, where he actually didn't listen to it at all and made a complete and utter fool of himself, not for the first time and probably not for the last. But they have this phrase called walk, cycle, end joy, which I've renamed walk, cycle, end joy. But basically there's a thing called universal basic mobility, and it would be a system of partnerships and or policies that provide a minimum level of mobility to all members of society. That just means giving everyone a bike, right?
Yeah, exactly.
An isolated static population is unhealthy, unproductive and unhappy. A mobile population is economically, culturally and socially dynamic.
How did they know we're unhappy?
Well, I mean,
telling us we're unhappy.
Survey after survey suggests this, Sandy.
By consensus, obviously.
Exactly. At Delphi Technique meetings, I mean, come on. UBM can harness automation and new mobility platforms to accelerate economic growth, providing everyone with access to employment and the means to improve their quality of life. Well, they must be geniuses, these people, mustn't they? How do they do that?
Yeah, utopia.
It sounds like it, very much so. This was actually on Technocracy Now. But basically, we've got some interesting stuff this week because out of all the technocratic issues and the new paradigm, we find that new data suggests that wind farms at high density will cause global warming, right? Above the 1.5.
Oh, Piers was talking about this
yesterday. Yeah, I've just been looking it up. It's really, really, really interesting because they've actually looked at the data, and for the amount of wind farms they need, it would raise the temperature to the 1.5 above, which they are absolutely terrified of. I don't quite know why, because they can't predict that at all. And we're going to get on to something else even more interesting in a bit about that. But I've just been looking at these articles today. And yes, Piers did indeed mention that yesterday. And you can find all this stuff on Technocracy Now. And also, we've got a news item here, which is from joannova.com.au. And it's about the Hadley data. And it says it's one of the most cited, most important databases for climate modelling and thus for policies involving billions of dollars. And this is the global warming gravy train. Now, Dr. John McLean has found freakishly improbable data and systematic adjustment errors, large gaps where there is no data, location errors, Fahrenheit temperatures as reported as Celsius, and spelling errors. Almost no quality control checks have been done. Outliers that are obvious mistakes have not been corrected. One town in Colombia spent 3 months in 1978 at an average daily temperature of over 80 degrees C. One town in Romania stepped out from summer in 1953 straight into a month of spring at minus 46 degrees C. These are supposedly average temperatures for a full month at a time. St. Kitts, a Caribbean island, was recorded at 0 degrees C for a whole month, and twice. So we've got this report that's just come out, and it's very, very interesting. I'd recommend anybody look at it, actually. I think what I'll do is I'll put it into the chat at some point and people can have a look at it, because it's got the most amazing data, and it's great to throw back at people who quote the 97%, because that is another fallacy that has been debunked. It's actually about 0.3% of scientists that agree with global warming, and this, if we've got time, we'll get into later. But this is how it starts. It says, the fate of the planet is at stake, but the key temperature data set used by climate models contains more than 70 different sorts of problems. Trillions of dollars have been spent because of predictions based on this data, yet even the most basic quality control checks have not been done. I think I'll skip straight to the major errors here. Yes, it's basically things like real thermostat data ignored. This is the Hadley Centre. It says the Hadley data, I'll carry on. Some of this is from the beginning. Temperatures for the entire southern hemisphere in 1850 and for the next 3 years are calculated from just one site in Indonesia and some random ships. Sea surface temperatures represent 70% of the Earth's surface, but some measurements come from ships which are logged at locations 100 kilometres inland. Others are in harbours which are hardly representative of the open ocean. When a thermometer is relocated to a new site, the adjustment assumes that the old site was always built up and heated by concrete and buildings. In reality, the artificial warming probably crept in slowly by correcting for buildings that likely didn't exist in 1880. Old records are artificially cooled. Adjustments for a few site changes can create a whole century of artificial warming trends. Now, this is quite interesting because I was looking at a paper earlier on by Dr. Tim Ball on climate change. And it's a brilliant article. And what happens with these people who go against this consensus reality is that they get really attacked. I was looking at a terrible website which is looking for funding called Rational Wiki, which should be called Irrational Neurotic Wiki, because all this they do is use ad hominem attacks against Dr. Tim Ball and call him a climate denier. Now, this is the whole paradigm, isn't it, that we've got? And it says here, let's have a look. Dr. Tim Ball, yeah. He's done a whole paper on it. That he said this is that yes, one slither of silver lining is in the level of corruption exposed to achieve a political agenda. Now it is easy for people to grasp the extent of corruption on the greatest deception in history, human-caused global warming, AGW. It is easier now to get them to understand that the left will do anything to achieve their goal. The significant differences between anthropological global warming and the Kavanaugh debacle were time and extent. The anthropological global warming deception has evolved slowly and insidiously since the late 1960s. It began as the objective of David Rockefeller's Club of Rome to control energy and thereby political power. It is just as corrupting and devastating an attack on American exceptionalism, but worse because it is global. It's the COR says, a group of world citizens sharing common concern for the future of humanity. Now, you talked about the Club of Rome yesterday, didn't you?
I did indeed. Yeah, I mean, the Club of Rome, I mean, they see themselves as this, it's a think tank, really. It's a think tank of elitists who feel that they need to make decisions about the way we live and the way that the world is run. And they seem to have their fingers in every pie, don't they?
Oh, yeah. Club of Rome member Maurice Strong took the urge to rule to the United Nations, where he put it into action. I'm just reading from this article because it's really powerful. Yeah. After spending 5 days with Strong at the UN, Elaine Dewar summarised his goal in her book, Cloak of Green. Strong was using the UN as a platform to sell a global environment crisis and the global governance agenda. And he carries on. He did this by creating a political monster known as Agenda 21 and creating the science to support the politics through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now, we talked about this yesterday, and a lot of people really believe that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is a scientific body when it isn't.
It's not. Absolutely.
It's not a scientific body.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know whether I've ever quoted this on your show, Mark, but when Maurice Strong, he led the Earth Summit in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro and managed to get 171 countries to sign up to Agenda 21. And he's, his whole thing has been, and also he along with Obama set up the Chicago Climate Exchange, and so we know where their reasons were monetary. They wanted to make the whole CO2 thing, monetize it, which they have very successfully done at our expense. The Club of Rome have written various reports over the years, but one of them dates back to 1968, and it's from a Club of Rome report called The First Global Revolution, by Alexander King and Bertrand Schneider. And on pages 104 to 105, it quotes, because of the sudden absence of traditional enemies, new enemies must be identified. In searching for a new enemy to unite us and formulate a crisis that would unite the world, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. all these crises would be caused by human intervention, which will require a global response that they may be overcome. The real enemy then is humanity itself. So actually, this is what it's all about. It's about creating, problem, reaction, solution, creating the problem, and the problem they decided was global warming. So the reaction is to tax CO2 and to blame
you can
CO2.
see that where this fitted in with the technocracy movement and the whole thing being hijacked and turned on its head. Like most of these things, they probably start out quite well intentioned and then they get taken over. He carries on in this article. He says, Real Climate explained on 22nd December 2004 why they started to use the new word consensus. It illustrates how political it was and how they knew it didn't apply to science, but the goal was deception. And we all know about this. We talk about this in the bigger picture. The use of Delphi technique, which is controlling the narrative of public opinion in public debates. And I gave examples of that yesterday. But he carries on, we've used the term consensus here a bit recently without ever really defining what we mean by it. In normal practice, there is no great need to define it. No science depends on it. But it's useful to record the core that most scientists agree on for public presentation. The consensus that exists is that of the IPCC reports, in particular the Working Group 1 report. By IPCC people, we tend to mean WG1. Right, he's got here now. In short, we agree. Therefore, there is a consensus. The academic source of the 97% claim, now this is what people throw at you all the time, 97% of scientists agree, came from John Cook, and this was from the IPCC in 2013 under the title Qualifying the Consensus on Anthropogenic Global Warming in the Scientific Literature. Now, Lord Monckton, Christopher Monckton, dissected the claim in his comment titled 0.3 consensus, not 97.1%. He explains how the authors divided 11,944 abstracts of articles into three categories using their own definitions. Now, Monckton used the author's own data file and endorsing the consensus hypothesis as thus defined. Now, inspection shows only 41 of the 64, or 0.3% of the entire sample, actually endorsed their hypothesis. This is of the global warming, right? Now, this is how things are fudged all the time, and this is how things are fudged in your local community. Because people say, well, I never agreed to this. How did they manage to get away with it? Well, basically because they lied blatantly. Yeah. And I saw this today happening. A great example of it was a Facebook page where people in a borough in London were being asked how many more roads they wanted to see closed. And they were going, well, we don't. But he said, we're being absolutely inundated by cycling groups. There can't be that many cycling groups in the borough. He says, because all of our friends are trying to get on and combat this. And we can't. Because why? The narrative is being controlled. By what? Consensus.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's got a very bad name, consensus, actually. And I first heard it used at the Occupy movement, and it's been downhill ever since, But it's absolutely fascinating looking at this stuff. And this guy Tim Ball, when you look how vilified he's been, and this just happens to all these scientists, and often they can't understand why. We did talk about this again yesterday, because you've got these people who are primarily scientists, and they get attacked by the media, and they can't understand why, because they're part of a community of scientists. And once they step outside the opinion corridor, the accepted opinion corridor of consensus, they get attacked. And usually these attacks are very childish and ad hominem. And that's what I find most irritating about this new situation, in that the attacks are so petty and personal, and they have nothing to do with facts, do they?
No, none at all. And it is interesting that it's at a time where people are feeling and realising that the freedom to be able to have an opinion and to actually speak out, against the narrow corridor of narrative that is being put about by all this. That if you do step out of that and you form an opinion and you say it, you are slapped down. Now that's like living in a Stasi, that where you cannot have free speech about and factual. We're talking about facts here. The narrative is a lie, and it's really difficult if you step out of that and start telling the truth. People don't like it.
Well, I think the thing is to stick to fact,
exactly.
And then you ask the other side to come back with an argument, because an argument is a legally defined thing. It doesn't mean you're bickering at each other. It means that you have standing.
And usually they don't come back. They can't come back. And if they do, they come back with petty stuff.
Yeah, I think we made these points on Richie Allen's show on Friday. I had a kind of very strong intro about that, and it was great yesterday though, because you get to meet people afterwards and you find out that they believe in certain things that they've been told which we don't, and you're starting to find that they think, oh well, if that's not true, well maybe that's not true either.
Yeah.
And I think this is it. That's why the talks are called The Bigger Picture, because they are the bigger picture, and what we're given is compartmentalised data as though everything's separate. And this is the problem with a lot of what they call scientific consensus, because it's within a box, it's within a limited expectation. A good example of this is when archaeologists find what they're looking for.
Yes.
And anything that they're not looking for, they discard.
Yeah.
And we've come up against this time and time again. When I talk to people about these sort of the ancients, the ancient civilizations, which nobody knows anything about. And one of the reasons why I stopped talking about a lot of this stuff on the shows with some of these authors is not to denigrate them, but they don't know anything more than I do unless they know historical data and times, which can be found. What tends to get added on is what people want to think.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the idea of this critical thinking, real critical thinking, is very important now, I think, because in my view, it's the most powerful weapon, because when you use this sort of economy of language and focus on the actual reality of what's being talked about, and you cut down the waffle, it becomes very powerful. And also, you stop wasting energy. So the Technocracy movement should like that, really, shouldn't it?
It should, really,
because you're conserving energy.
Exactly. Indeed, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was looking at all this stuff this afternoon, and I was really interesting because it was all about Hubbert's Peak. That, and of course we know now, and we've been looking at what is oil, and that is really interesting because you've got
put that into my presentation actually, because it's something that a lot of people don't know. And we use these terms, don't we? Like fossil fuels.
Yeah.
Well, there's no evidence that oil's made out of fossils whatsoever, and there's strong evidence that it's not.
Yeah.
So I find that.
And that's a shock. That was a shock to me as well, because we've been taught that from when we were at school, but if you actually look at the evidence, there's no evidence to prove that it is from, dead dinosaurs and fossils. And I mean, how many dinosaurs had to die to create crude oil? I mean,
we were talking about that today. Yeah, exactly. And it was the Russians who started drilling at depths of up to about 40,000 feet, and they discovered what they call abiotic oil, which is created deep within the earth. So we use these terms and they're used against us, and then you find out they're not true. And I think this is the great thing about creating argument. Creating argument is the key to it for me, because then you can shut down this kind of lunacy that's going on. I mean, I found that to be one of the most interesting parts of the talk, really, focusing on these points which people don't really know about.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing is about a lot of the places where we're going to be doing talks is that you're going to get people who believe in global warming who are going to come to the talks. And the thing is about this religion is that it's very dogmatic and it has an apocalypse. So you are talking about a pretty dangerous kind of cult here. And this is why you get these terrible ad hominem attacks. And I think this is the problem, that the quiet voice of reason isn't heard. It's nice to have sound bites, I think. And yes, this economy of language to me is the most important thing at the moment. But yeah, there it is. I've got the myth.
Yeah. It was a really interesting part. If you were talking the article about Yeah,
it was the Soviet Union who tasked their top scientists to identify the actual source of oil. In 1956, Russian scientists Professor Vladimir Porivyev announced that crude oil and natural petroleum gas have no intrinsic connection with biological matter originating near the surface of the Earth. They are primordial, originating from with the Earth's formation. That's what he's saying. These primordial materials, which they've been erupted from great depths. So then they go on to say that Russia referred to oil as abiotic oil because it was not created from the decomposition of biological life forms, but rather from chemical processes continually occurring inside the Earth. And this is what they discovered when they started drilling for it up to 40,000 feet below the Earth's surface, and far below the depth which organic matter can be found, which is at 18,000 feet.
Wow, yeah.
So, these things are incredibly important.
It's weird because, everything that we've been taught, you almost have to turn it right round again. And it's quite a shock to some people because it's just suddenly realising that you've been lied to for many, many years on all sorts of subjects. But all of it seems to have a common aim. The lies have been constructed for a common aim, and it really is interesting. And I also noted that within the technocracy movement, Hubbard actually moved out of the technocracy movement at one point because he needed to earn a living, and Hubbard's peak was created when he went to work in the oil industry. So it was like creating a scarcity, and that's the whole thing about peak oil. It's the fear. Oh, we're going to run out.
Oh yeah, the peak oil thing was massively promoted, wasn't it?
It was.
I think
huge.
Mike Rupert eventually went into peak oil, didn't he?
Yeah.
COP versus CIA. That's when I sort of stopped listening to him. But loads of people keep saying it, as though it's true. Yeah. We've got some interesting things in chat here. Martin's come up with Model T Ford was designed to run on gas or alcohol. Well, that would be... Well, running it on alcohol would cost a fortune, unless you got it from Wetherspoons, I suppose. Or the cash and carry, obviously. Or made it yourself, even easier. Yeah, only joking. But, yes, just having a look at what's in chat. And, yeah, Lee's saying, don't worry, the comet god is coming. Now, that's interesting, actually, Lee, because over the next couple of weeks I'm going to be putting out some stuff which I've been collecting for a long time, not exactly based on the works of Comins Beaumont, who I called Comets Beaumont. And he was a guy who wrote the Mysterious Comet, The Riddle of the Earth, and many other books which kind of changed the geographical locations of historical events, among a lot of other stuff. And my friend puts his work out through a website called ResonanceBookworks.com. But yeah, this ties into the lies of history as well. And to me, that's one of the most fascinating areas, because we've now sort of looked into what's going on in the present and trying to get that into something very small and concentrated has been my aim for ages. I've been looking at all this disparate sort of information, and broadly it does come under this Agenda 2030 stuff, doesn't it? Agenda 21 and this technocracy movement. So that really is a kind of spine for the whole thing, which it hangs off, isn't it, really?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, a lot of things came up yesterday in the talk, and quite honestly, it's almost as though everything that is going wrong or seemingly going wrong in our world, all roads lead to sustainable development at the end of the day, because we're being funneled into this belief system that if we don't do what we're told if you want to save the planet, you've got to, stick to these rules, and it's a form of total control. And it is interesting that yesterday we did have a lot of people who came who, the area of Bristol we were in, they were quite sort of liberal kind of minded people. And a lot of them were, came because they were beginning to question, the narrative that they've been given. And a lot of them were people that did believe in, or do believe in global warming. And I think just literally, because we only ever deal with facts, and that's what I like about working with Mark, is it's very factual. We don't put anything out that hasn't got a basis of truth in it from facts. And people began to sort of really listen and ask very intelligent questions, so it was really good.
Yeah, I sometimes feel that I pack too much information in, because it's almost like there's about 7 or 8 talks in my talk, but it's my way of kind of condensing stuff that I've got from a lot of different sources. I mean, I even brought up occult Freemasonry, because that ties into this belief system almost exactly as a template, which is really interesting. Yeah. And people tend to go off on these paths of occult wiffle waffle, but when you actually take these things down to what they are, it all starts to really make sense. And that's been something I've been trying to do for over 20 years. I mean, I read in this sort of occult information, which means hidden information, and information about hidden history, and it's putting it into a framework which is factual without actually going off on your own tangents. Because that's what I find with a lot of this sort of work, is that you get some really good information, and then authors start to want to make a name for themselves by being the creator of the whole thing. In other words, they almost control the narrative themselves by omitting what they don't want to hear. The same as the people we're talking about, really. So that to me is the main thing, and I'm very, very lucky in that I've attracted some great people who listen to the show. Our audience is not that big. However, the people who do listen send me the most amazing information. So we do have an audience of people who can critically think. And I did congratulate the audience on that yesterday.
No, it was great. They were a fantastic bunch, and came up with some really, really good questions at the end. And you suddenly realise that there's people out there who can think critically. It's great, because our education system is not really doing that. It's not turning out people that think for themselves, and that's a bit of a worry.
I think it's the use of language as well, and I was talking to peers about that yesterday, because it's interesting that you get some people who have been still taught trivium method of thinking, which is logic, grammar and rhetoric. In other words, being able to state facts, express them properly and form an argument. And that to me is the core of everything. And if you're not taught that, then you're liable to take on opinion as fact.
Yeah.
It's a different way of thinking, and that's why only 1% of the population were taught to think critically, because the 99% did not have to. And that's interesting, because we always hear about the 99%, don't we? Well, the thing is, I made the point, is that people need to take that responsibility for themselves, because the choice is actually theirs. The choice is yours, how you approach things. And if you accept things, then that is all that is needed. This is a form of black magic, and that is where the occult side of it comes in, because black magic has to be with consent. You have to consent to it. All right, the system makes you consent, or implies that you have to consent if you don't do this. For instance, say forms, this is on a basic level, right? I learnt this years ago, that any form that's sent out by the police or any other organisation, you do not have to fill in their form, which entraps you if you supply the evidence yourself. So you strip down what you want them to actually hear, what is important, what is your statutory duty to supply, and you don't do anything else. That's all you have to do. And to me, that's all about the economy of language as well. It's about being able to express yourself in a very clear way, but also know what the system is up to, because it's all about entrapping you into things and things done by assumption.
Absolutely.
Which is, I think, you were into that years ago, weren't you? You were into the free man stuff and all that, or the free woman stuff.
Well, yeah. I mean, yes. I mean, I sort of, on the edge of it. Yeah, there was a movement here called Lawful Rebellion, but the free man stuff didn't seem, it seemed to fall apart. And Lawful Rebellion did for a while. I'm not sure how it's getting on now, because the people that organised it, some of them have moved out of the area. But I don't really keep up with it because I've got so much to do in this area. So yeah, but there's a lot of it is language, and yeah.
Question for Mark: how would you describe the USA judge business with reference to Alinsky? That's Saul Alinsky, who wrote Rules for Radicals. Well, the Alinsky method seems to be used by a lot of these media people. I mean, if you look at Democrats, they use that method all the time. It's basically the ad hominem attack. And if you look at Rules for Radicals, we've got them actually printed. I put them in my talk. Just look up Saul Alinsky Rules for Radicals. Now, what's interesting is he says humour is a man's best weapon, but these sort of extremist leftists, if you want to call them that, never use humour. It's funny.
No, they don't.
That's funny that they don't use humour. No,
they can't laugh at themselves. I mean, yeah, or anything else by the looks of it.
Well, that's the thing, you see, and I did a mission statement as well at the end of yesterday's talk, which I'm not going to put it on the website because I want people just to think of one themselves, really, and not use a template. Never use templates, because templates will then be undermined. It's like, it's like these people say, oh, you got that off the internet. Well, everything's on the internet. Is there anything that isn't on the internet? So it means that Halsbury's Laws of England aren't on the internet.
Exactly. The BBC's on the internet. What, you mean you don't believe the BBC?
I say, it's like, that's funny, isn't it? Oh, you got that off the internet. As though it's some kind of conspiracy theory, that it exists, But, I mean, the part of it is say we are an unaffiliated group of local residents concerned about the lack of democratic process in local government planning and policy. We will remain unaffiliated as individuals acting collectively and within the law towards a truly inclusive democratic process where all voices are heard. It carries on, but that's the gist of it. And basically, we're not affiliated with anything. We're individuals acting collectively. We're not a collective with no individuality. And that's the difference. Yeah. So I think that's probably one of the best places to leave it tonight. We could go on, but I think an hour show is quite good. We're both a little bit burnt out here from the show yesterday and the conversations and the travelling afterwards. But is there anything you'd like to say, Sandy? Because obviously I do this every week.
Well, interesting. I mean, I need to get something from the other room. Yeah, somebody gave me a leaflet in my pub tonight, and it was a woman. And when I first saw it, I thought, this is radical feminist sort of. She gave me some leaflets about protect women's rights, and I thought, oh, here we go. And when I actually flipped it over, it was about the gender recognition law that's going through Parliament right now. And actually, I suddenly thought, there is something weird about all this, because we know that gender is becoming very blurred at the moment, and this is all part of this agenda to destroy the family and genders, and to also get genders fighting. And it's interesting because apparently this law is going through quite soon. It's in October, and they have to get petitions in by the 19th of October. But it's about men being able to declare that they are women without any kind of medical kind of medical proof that, and they certainly don't need to go through any kind of sex change. And it is weird, and it's bringing in this whole thing that men can go into women's loos, they can go into they can go into men or women's loos, and I find it quite interesting, because you've got a load of radical feminists now are pitching against each other, because some of them do want gender recognition because they think it's cool and it's okay, and then you've got the other feminists fighting against it because they think that actually it's a dangerous thing to be playing with, because actually you're taking something away from the feminine, from women. And in Glastonbury, we have these things like moon lodges and stuff like that. So there's this big thing going on in Glastonbury about whether men who've still got all their tackle are allowed into moon lodges. And I find the whole thing really interesting because, again, it's pitching the feminist movements against each other.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
It's a divide and rule strategy,
yeah.
and it's a strategy to create mental confusion and inner turmoil, basically.
Yeah.
And that's all part of it. And that is part of the bigger picture. That's it for this week. And thanks for everyone for being in chat. And we'll see you all next week, Sunday, 9 p.m. And thanks for listening to Windows on the World, everybody. And I'll be looking at what's been written in chat just after the show. I might stay in there for a bit. So that's good night from me and Sandy Adams.
Good night.
And we'll see you next week.